Hello, everyone. My name is Kathleen Kingdon, and for the past 35 years, I have been the voice channel for Ascended Master Djwhal Khul. And this particular Equinox, we're celebrating that 35-year partnership. And in honor of that, the Vajra Flame Foundation has underwritten this video production and is making it available worldwide for anyone who's interested. So if you'll give me just a moment, I'll get Master, and he's all yours. Beloved beings, I greet you at a beautiful time on earth when the daylight and darkness hours come into balance. And what is so beautiful about this is it sets an example for human beings to find balance in their own lives. And living here in the 21st century, most of you have figured out that balance is not so easy. When you look around the world, you see many things that are imbalanced. Certainly the balance between humans and their relationship to the land and the sky and the oceans is way out of balance. In fact, as many of you know, the oceans now have gigantic floating masses of plastic, in some cases the size of Texas, that is just debris that has washed into the ocean and been congealed by a natural gyration form within the ocean. And if you look at what has happened to humanity's lives, it seems that people no longer work for 8 hours a day for 5 days a week. At least that's the scenario here in the States. But many people take their work home with them at night and work all weekends. And when we look at this, we have to say something is truly out of balance. Indeed, when you live in a world that is out of balance, the big question becomes, how can you personally find balance in your own life? There are pressures and stresses and quotas and so on coming at you all day long, seemingly every day. So much to do, and apparently so little time to carry it off. When you look back to prior generations, for many of you 2 generations ago, the world was much more balanced. Your grandparents worked their hours. If they worked in the fields, on farms, they worked longer hours in the summer and shorter hours in the winter. But even a couple of generations ago, there was 1 day a week taken to restore one's inner realm, and thus finding some kind of balance. But in the secular world, there seems no time for the sacred time that used to be a given. And in many ways, this has had a very harsh and perhaps even negative effect upon the psyches of so many people. People rush from moment to moment, activity to activity, responsibility to responsibility, and none of it ever seems to quit. In fact, with the advent of the digital reality that you have today, one can take often his or her work with him 24/7. And when we look at that, we have to say, is this really good for people? Is it good for the planet? What does it do for one's relationships? There was a time, again, perhaps a couple of generations ago, where people invited people to their home on a regular basis, sometimes a couple of times a month. Perhaps they would share an important and finely crafted meal, but there would always be lots of stimulating conversation. And if you could peek into those rooms, you would see that people really enjoyed each other. They enjoyed communication. They enjoyed finding out how each other saw the world. But in the world today, what you notice all too much is that societies are dividing. There are polarized relationships, and it may look political, but it certainly infuses itself into virtually every aspect of life. Indeed, when you compare the political left with the political right, you may notice that they don't eat the same foods. They don't go to the same movies. They don't read the same books, nor do they have the same pastimes. And so we really do have to say, what has happened that the middle, which used to comprise the greatest number of humans, now has shrunken, so that people align themselves more toward the polar regions than into that bridging or center space. And in the long run, this has an effect upon how people see each other, how people relate to each other, and how people spend their time, and how they identify themselves as 21st century humans. Nearly everyone is very aware of the pressure of stress. Now, often that stress comes internally from oneself, but nonetheless, it seems to be a constant for so many people. And when that pressure is there, particularly when one pays too much attention to it, it is impossible to live or even to feel balanced. Now, if you look back, let's say, to some of the great thinkers and philosophers and even the great teachers that have come to earth, you will see that they were always pretty balanced people. If you take the man Jesus, his, what's the phrase you have? His feathers did not ruffle easily. And that is true of the Buddha. It is certainly true of Lao Tzu. And you can find great beings all throughout history who somehow managed to balance their lives. Indeed, we could say they became masters of balance. And the Buddha did this by teaching people to pay attention to where their mind went. And when it went in a direction that was not helpful for their understanding a situation or being present, he taught them to drop it. And even the Master Jesus said, or instructed his followers, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. And even if you go back into the ancient Hebraic text and you see that old primary Kabbalistic glyph of the tree of life, when divine light begins to manifest, the first separation is into what we could call the cosmic masculine and the cosmic feminine, or Bina and Chakma. And these are energetic positions that then launch forth this lightning flash of creation to even distill things into matter, not only planets, but all the things that eventually arrive and take up habitation there. If we go back to Lao Tzu, a famous Chinese philosopher, he lived about 600 years before the Buddha. And if you read his teachings, you will really see how Buddhism naturally flowed from Taoism. But the Taoist wanted to find the one perfect energy that inhabits everything, that runs everything, and that restores everything. And so if you, I suggest this is a good time for people to read the Tao Te Ching, which is the writings of Lao Tzu. And I believe it's about verse 56, where he says, "Those who know do not tell. Those who tell do not know." It's not to set the tongue loose, but to curb it. It's not to have edges that catch, but to remain untangled, unblinded, unconfused is to find balance. And the one who holds balance beyond the sway of love and hate, beyond reach of profit or loss, beyond the care for praise or blame, has attained the highest post in the world. Now think about that. What he's saying is that nothing really matters if one does not have balance. Certainly, you can look at the world right now and you can see how much balance is needed. And it's all very graphically reflected back to people on a moment-to-moment nature. But you see, until people really come to a point where they find balance in themselves, where they are at peace with their own mind, at peace with the world, and at peace with the divine, it's very difficult to establish balance, isn't it? We talked about a time a couple of generations ago when It was just common practice to have one day set aside where one did no work. In the Hebrew tradition, it was Saturday, and the admonition is to remember the Sabbath, or seventh day, and keep it holy. In the Christian tradition, the first day of the week was honored because that was the day of the week that Jesus arose from the dead, and that day was to be kept holy. But nowadays, when you look at the world, you see so much is changing in the religious area. Certainly, the churches are having big, significant problems to address, and people are losing their faith in virtually every spiritual tradition around the world. And it's not that I'm trying to tell you you should have the faith of your fathers and mothers or your grandparents. That won't work. You live in your time. But you have to have something deep within you to which you can connect that is bigger than your own little story, your own local self. This is why you have many people involved in causes. They may be political, but they may be environmental, or they may be providing aid to countries in need or to people in need. All of these are causes that become bigger than themselves, and thus that bigness of the cause gives a person purpose. So if one has the purpose of communicating the dangers of a changing climatic reality for the planet, you see their passion if they have it, and really the more passion they have for it, you could say the more they are identified with the cause, and therefore the stronger their purpose. This is true in any realm, but it is vitally true not to just go from work, work, work in one's work life into work, work, work in one's causes without having the time to nurture oneself. You see, when you have a situation where people are severely divided, they naturally mistrust one another. And I think certainly in the West, and it's very prominent here in the U.S., but it's in other countries too, the less people can trust one another, the more discordant they become toward each other, and the more they come off balance. The more they lose the moral and spiritual underpinnings of life on earth. And people do not have to agree on how they see their spiritual reality, but they need one. And again, for some, that takes the form of serving others in a very direct and immediate way. For others, it's more a life of devotion and prayer. And for others, it is maybe they take time every day to try and re-envision a world that is full of peace and charity, but not one where everyone is necessarily homogeneous. You see, it's not that people have to be the same. Indeed, there's something very powerful in the diversity, whether it's racial diversity, whether it's climatic diversity, whether it's the diversity of a plant life and animal life that just make this planet a wonderful place to be, or even whether it's a diversity in thought, how I see something, and here's how someone else sees something. And maybe if we learn to come into balance and talk to one another, we can learn something from the other's position. Unfortunately, many people are very threatened by hearing the position of another, perhaps fearing that they will change their own mind. And when this happens, they lose their grounding, and they begin to see the other as the enemy, or at least some negative force in their life. And this is counterproductive for our ever finding our way to a collectively held field of peace on this planet. And so I guess what I'm suggesting is that if you truly want balance in your life, you cannot look to the world to inspire you toward balance. It will ask you to work more hours, do more things, be perpetually in a mode that is sometimes referred to as multitasking, which maybe not be all it's cracked up to be. but it will continually give you more diversions, more stuff to process internally, more, more, more. In fact, if I could give you a mantra for most people today, it would be the mantra of more, faster, more, faster, more, faster. That is the way the 21st century inputs on your consciousness, factors, and even on your hearts. So you see, it is naive to think that this kind of a scenario in which to experience does not affect your relationships. Certainly your close-in relationships bear the brunt of whatever you carry home from work or the last political rally or whatever. Those energies get imprinted in your personal relationships. They inform your conversation. They sometimes cloud your beliefs or take up all of the belief area in your precious mind. And you have to ask, is this what you really want? Do you just want to follow whatever? Do you want to follow the latest political craze? Do you want to follow? Well, following is okay if people are really awake and thinking for themselves. But you can't really feel very successful at trying to go backwards in time and bring the old institutions forward into the now, because this is a different time. All of you can see that. No matter what country you live in, you can all see that the things that worked even so close as 2 generations ago often do not work very well now. Different tasks, different pressures, different values are all affecting people that coincide with this time frame. Well, for those of you who understand, or at least fascinated with astrology, you know that the planet, as it moves through its multi-year cycles, goes through ages, astrological ages that can last anywhere from 21 to 2,500 years using the Western system. And what's interesting about that is it means that the planet is in alignment with a particular stellar constellation. And each stellar constellation, being different from all the others, not only in shape, but in energetic format, each one flows some kind of energy to all the bodies, the celestial bodies, the suns, the moons, the stars, and the planets that are under their influence. And so right now, as Earth is moving away from the influence of the constellation Pisces and really more fully aligning with the constellation Aquarius, the energy changes. And you actually can feel it. In fact, the point we marked the energy finally having the biggest shift was back on the winter solstice of 12/21/2012. And at that time, certainly the Vajra Foundation hosted an event where people were out at the turning of midnight walking a labyrinth, really trying to release the old and embrace the new, even though the new hadn't been all set up yet. In fact, it still isn't. It will take probably another couple hundred years before people really understand the difference in the world now as it is becoming and how it operated and the mentalities that worked in the Piscean age. So really, we could say that part of what your job is now, if you're living on planet Earth, is to understand how to balance the Piscean age and the Aquarian age, because you see you're still on the threshold between these two ages. And that's kind of an interesting notion, because at first glance they don't seem to be that much alike. The mentality that grew out of the Piscean age, and I'm not saying this is Piscean mentality unequivocally. This is how it got translated on this planet, having come through the Piscean age. But it was very male-dominated. It was very much aligned with power over. And when we look at the Aquarian energies or feel into them, we see that that's not going to work anymore. That the Aquarian energies is much more about power for. So it may be power for the family. It may be power for a community. It may, hopefully, one day be power for all the people of Earth. And thus the empowering of the disempowered is an important mission that I believe will become much more observable as we get a little further into the Aquarian age. But as you think about just being on the threshold between these two ages, it's kind of exciting, isn't it? No one knows how all of it will unfold. And looking back, people tend to pay attention probably more to their points of pain or their points of power. And if you look carefully at the world right now, you can see that this is clearly what governments are trying to figure out. Many are still coming at it with the power over mentality rather than the empowering of the people that are governed. And we could look at this and say it's a classic mistake, because what worked in a prior age is not going to work as we go into a new age. And yet, how people will govern is not yet defined. What we believe is happening, based on the nature of Aquarian energies, is that there will be a much more relational quality to the energies coming from Aquarius than those that came from Pisces. You remember that the Piscean age was known as the age of the individual. From my seat in the bleachers, I might say it was the age of the ego. And it seems to me that humanity pushed the envelope of the ego about as far as it can go. And I would say it's rather stretched right now. Out of this stretching, though, if you think of an image such as two groups of people playing tug of war, and they have a rope between them, both sides pulling on it, if they could sustain equal forces on both ends, eventually that rope would snap. And in a sense, that's kind of what's happening. Maybe a tug of war is a little bit of a misnomer, but you get the idea of the Piscean energy, or the energies of the Piscean age pulling against the energies of the Aquarian age. And if you could see a rope, we would begin to see that it's fraying. And out of that snap, when it finally happens, could emerge a brand new reality, perhaps one that is more balanced. So you see, if you would choose to attain the highest post in the world, you have to find a way to be centered, to remain in your core. You know, people, person to person, people define balance differently. And yet, when it comes to balance in the personal realm, it all comes from the same intention, to be permanently connected to an internal place that is very stable, that is sane, that is kind, and that is able to observe whatever comes before it without reactivity. Now, I know that some people mistake states of denial for a state of neutrality, but they're really not the same. If neutrality is legitimate, it's highly engaged. And by that I mean the person really cares about what she or he is observing. The person really cares about how their conversation is affecting the other, the recipient. The person really cares about the efforts, their joint efforts, coming to somehow bring themselves and perhaps others to a higher level. So it's engaged and creative in all the right ways. But it's not emotionally reactive. It's not caustic or discordant. It is patient. It is kind. Sort of what St. Paul said in the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians about how people would recognize love. It's not boastful. It's patient. And this is a true mark of balance, when one can have patience. Lao Tzu said in the very next verse that basically the idea of one who is really balanced is the one who can face the troubles of the world, but not be personally troubled. And that's interesting to consider, isn't it? When you look at what the world brings you, right now it's bringing you a lot of problems. And the answer is not to deny it or to go into some sleep trance and say, oh, I can't be bothered with that. They're too big for me. I can't do anything to change it. You can do things to change it. You can change your relationship with plastic, which is a huge learning point right now for anyone who wants to remain an inhabitant of Earth. Some of you saw that interesting article about the young whale that beached itself in Thailand and was in a great deal of distress and pain. It was very sick, and it eventually died. And so an autopsy was done. And in its belly was 17 pounds of plastic, mostly plastic bags. When you think about getting to the level of 17 pounds from plastic bags, that's a tremendous number of pieces of plastic, isn't it? But all manner of sea creatures, not only the big mammals, certainly the turtles and the birds, they're all feeding on plastic right now. Clearly, this is out of balance. And you can look at that and you can hang your head and say, too bad, too bad. Earth was really a nice place at one time. Or you can form coalitions to solve the problem, and you can do it from a place of highly engaged neutrality. Neutrality doesn't mean you don't care. It means you don't react when things either go your way or don't go your way. You can be calm and held in that center, which is the highest attainable post in the entire world. You see, your minds are very precious. So are your hearts. And it is incumbent upon you, not only for yourself, but for those you care about, and indeed for the world as a whole, for these poor marine mammals eating plastic. It is incumbent upon you to stay clear and be your very best self. This doesn't mean you ignore the world. It also doesn't mean you ignore the things your boss wants you to do on your weekends. You find a way to do it with balance. But you learn a new respect for balance, because that kind of calm sanity can give you the mooring or the underpinnings of a sane life. And it is so what the planet needs. But you see, it's also what you need. You can, I'm sure, all look around you and see people who are just exceedingly frenetic, going from task to task to task, perhaps the blood pressure going up, that internalized sense of a pressure to get it all done, or a pressure about what others expect of me, or a pressure about getting the schedule completed today. Now, all those things do serve useful ends in terms of productivity, but they don't always serve useful ends in terms of sanity. And so as the earth now comes into a place of balance, it's very interesting. It's just a few seconds. The equinox is really quick. The sun passes over the celestial equator, and right now it's going from north to south, and so the northern hemisphere goes into autumn and winter, the southern hemisphere into spring and summer. But that point where it's equal is very short, just takes a few seconds. And you see, in your own lives, you don't have points that come around annually where suddenly your life comes into balance. If you attain balance, you must create it. And of course, it's a great privilege to be able to do this. But it's also, well, that privilege implies some responsibility, doesn't it? You do it not just for yourself. You do it for yourself so that you can be a model of sanity in the world, so that you can be kinder, more generous, more loving, more patient. But all of those attributes are energies that you really give to other people. Why? Because you can. And it is very important to remember that there are practices, there are ways of being in your skin that you can do, and therefore you choose to live in that way, to bring yourself to a little higher level, to a little more peaceful level, a place where you engender kindness and goodness in everyone with whom you speak or interact. You do this not because anyone is making you. You do this because it represents the highest of what humanity can be. You look in the world nowadays, you'll see many people who are public examples, many of them political leaders in one form or another. And they seem to be normalizing bad behavior. And I have watched what an influence this has on ordinary people. They now feel legitimatized in saying anything they want to say to anybody, calling it their truth. And I see it. People have become more paranoid. People have become more suspicious. And this is not to say that everything is as it appears. Indeed, it is not. But if you lose that ability to relate to other people because they are having an experience of being human just as you are, then I suggest you have lost something that will take generations, if ever, to replace. And as you think of your children and their children and the world that you are now handing over to them, wouldn't it be nice if each of you personally could ensure, through the living of your life, a little more balance, a little more kindness, a little more patience? It's up to you. Indeed, you are the ones who have come here now. You are here probably less by chance than most of you think about, but that's a teaching for another time. But you are here to discover all you can be as humans. You know, in my own training, in many of my Tibetan lives, we use words that don't always translate all that well into English, but when we use the term human, we were taught to say it with awe. You know, it's a pretty remarkable creation, isn't it? The type of consciousness, the amazing capacities of a body, the ability to create, to love, to make changes. It's all pretty amazing. So we were taught, when we use that word, to think of the highest that humans could be, and to see humans imbued with reverence for the divine, certainly, but for things they didn't understand as well. And rather than replacing that with anger at the things one doesn't understand, to hold a little bit of the mystery and approach it as mystery. How did this come to being? I mean, take the digital reality. For some of you who have a few more years under your belts, it's all like magic, isn't it? Yet to those that understand it, it's all very practical and useful. And so, in the midst of your own life, wherever you live, whoever the people are who surround you and share your experience, both those who are up close and those who are more distant from you personally, for their sakes, and of course for yours, it is important to bring yourself consciously to a state where you know that place of inner serenity that we call balance. It is there in every spiritual tradition. And my sense is that as you go into the Aquarian age, you will learn to express that truth perhaps quite differently than it was expressed in the Piscean age. It isn't a matter of being better or worse. It's that you're in different times. The energies coming to the planet are different. But we could see that all through the last, let's say, well, probably ever since the French Revolution, which was when the Aquarian energies first began coming to Earth in little spurts. We began to see something amazing. If you go back and you look at the hue and cry of the people that were engaged in revolting, what was it for? Liberty, freedom, the ability to choose their own friends and have a say in how they were governed. Now, compared to what came before, that's pretty Aquarian. It may not look like it today because you've come a lot further. And one of the wonderful things about the Piscean age was it is also an age of education. Education followed certain people all around the world and came to even very remote cultures. People began to learn to read and to write. And it seems so simple now, but that was such a huge step in changing how people communicate, how they understand one another, and how they can exude balance and show compassion. You see, when you are balanced, then you have enough spaciousness inside to truly feel compassion for the suffering of all other beings. That's true whether it is a human, whether it is a little animal running from a forest fire, or perhaps eating plastic in the ocean, or whether it is the plants that are now finding it difficult to live because certain areas the temperature has raised just a little bit too much for them. It's very interesting to see how you will approach that, how you will let it in and help make you a better person. This is what's coming to you. And I think never more was it more important for people to find balance. And so part of what we're offering with this global celebration of the equinox is not only free access to this teaching, but I've also prepared a meditation on balance that will also be available free of charge. And I'd like to encourage all of you to do it, because I think if you are really honest with yourself, you know you desire balance. You know it doesn't feel good to be strung out from this task to that task, from this responsibility to that, never feeling like you have enough time, never having time to restore your soul or nurture that heart space inside of you that mirrors the great heart of the cosmos. So as we celebrate balance, both the 22nd and 23rd of September, I invite you to focus on balance. I invite you to really ask yourself the hard questions about where you're out of balance and to try to discover what it might be to truly achieve balance in those areas. Be honest with yourself. It's not about saying the things in your life you don't like. You do that all the time anyway. It's about finding where you're not in balance and bringing a kind of deep and perfect spiritual calmness into that space and learning to create your life from there. Indeed, I bless and love each and every one of you. And on this equinox holiday, I wish you peace, joy, love, and supreme balance. I thank you.